Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to spend some time with all of us as we host the OALA's interdisciplinary debate on the future of housing, affordability, and quality of life. I'm Ina Budrovics, the Executive Director of the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects. Thank you. Thank you. April, as you all must know, is an exciting time for all of us. On my way here, I was reflecting that we have a lot to celebrate on this month. And at this time, I'd like to ask all of you, raise your hand if you have something that you'd like to share that you are celebrating this month that we could all take part in celebrating. Anyone? Anyone? Howard would like everyone to know we are celebrating David Crombie's 88th birthday coming up on April 24th. Encompassing the entire month is April is World Landscape Architecture Month, so that's a yay bonus. April 22nd is also Earth Day. Along these lines, anyone has anything else exciting? Anniversaries, been with the firm for 25 years? No? Okay. The solar eclipse is happening. That's like a big event, absolutely. And I'm also celebrating, I have just returned from parental leave for 15 months, and I'm honestly very excited to see all your faces in the crowd tonight. Before we launch into speakers, I would like to start by acknowledging that we gather on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. We are all invited to reflect on this, each in our own way, as we carry on in our discussions this evening. The OALA is excited to host this crucial conversation, as it's imperative to address the intricate relationship between housing affordability and the fundamental elements that shape our living environments. Those being sunlight, microclimate, and public spaces as natural resources not only illuminate our surroundings, but also play a crucial role in determining the quality of our living spaces and the well-being of those who live there. Balancing rapid urban growth, fueled by the need for affordable housing, is a conversation that must be had. By fostering this interdisciplinary dialogue here tonight, we aim to uncover innovative approaches and actionable strategies that will address the complex challenges of housing affordability. This evening's event is proudly sponsored by Maglan Site Furniture, and we are grateful for the support they provide OALA in bringing these events to you. Jeff Roddick from Maglan is here tonight. Jeff, give a wave. And Jeff, he's always a fun and innovative person to chat with, so I do invite you to say hi, and we would like to thank Maglan for their sponsorship. Before we begin or continue our beginnings, I would like to remind you that this event will be recorded or is already being recorded so that we can share it with our wider membership and audiences on our social media channels, newsletters, and YouTube channel. And that is why for the Q&A portions, I will ask that you please hold your question until we can get this roaming mic to you for that purpose. Now, I am pleased to welcome Sean Waters, OALA Council Member and Mayor of the Township of Centre Wellington, but I won't steal his thunder, he'll have more on that in a minute, to introduce our first speaker. As an active volunteer, Sean is a strong advocate for the OALA's Practice Act. This is an OALA ongoing initiative and goal to advance the profession of landscape architecture and recognize landscape architects as professionals and respected leaders in their industry. So thanks for your work, Sean, in that initiative, and please welcome to the stage.
Hello, folks. Welcome to our sold-out OALA Town Hall, even though there's a few empty seats. My understanding it was sold out tonight. And I'm really happy to be here for this presentation, Town Hall, on the life and death of Canadian cities. My name is Sean Waters, and I've been on the Ontario Association board for about 3 years. And I'm a practicing landscape architect for the last 25 years, and I've seen a classmate back there. That's pretty exciting. I've been a proud member of the OALA along with my 2,000 colleagues who are helping us present this today and and their thoughts. I know there are some here and people from all over watching this, and this is something that's very near and dear to our hearts, this presentation today on housing. I'd like to thank the OALA staff, which includes Angie and Shelley and Ina and Sorry, and I did have Sherry in here. Angie, Sherry, Anna, and Ingrid for their hard work putting tonight's program together. I'd like to acknowledge special thanks to Sonia Evangela, who's an OALA member and someone who's worked in the background to help foster the lineup and craft this evening tonight. So, as was mentioned, about a year and a half ago, I became a mayor, which is kind of weird. I was elected mayor of Centre Wellington, which is in Wellington County. So anyone might know where Wellington County is. It's just a little bit north of Guelph. And there's two little communities there. They're not so much little now, Fergus and Laura. So I happen to be the mayor for that community. And like everywhere else right now, we're experiencing a tremendous amount of growth in our community. And it's just not in cities. We're seeing, as you know, there were 29 communities which are identified to grow throughout Ontario. And some of them you're probably quite familiar with. Some are not so familiar, but places like Ottawa, Kingston, London, Windsor, communities within the Golden Horseshoe, GTA were all identified. And really, part of their job was to build houses for about 1.2 million people. So over the next 10 years, which is really a daunting task. We happen to be, in my community, Centre Wellington, just adjacent to Guelph, and we're part of that growth program as well. We're going from 30,000 people to 60,000 people, which is a lot of growth within the next 20 years. And we're right now in the midst of expanding our urban boundary. So right now we have requests for over 2,600 acres of developable lands. And just give you an understanding of what 2,600 acres is. So, anyone been to High Park? Any hands here? Yeah. Well, it's a big park, as we all know. That's 400 acres. Times that by 6. That is the growth that's going to happen in our community. Oh, you might have heard another park, Central Park. That's 800 acres. We're 3 times that size. So next time when you're in New York overlooking Central Park, think of Centre Wellington. So that is a scary and a daunting thought for a rural community which has a lot of history. If you've been to, we've been tagged like, if I see another blog TO on Laura, I think I'm going to puke. But thank you for all coming because it's really promoted our community. We get close to 1 million people a year in our community, which is amazing for a place that's 8,000 people. So, but speaking of acreage, so 2,600, imagine that. That is a big, big place. If there was a development in Toronto, which was 2,600 acres, you would definitely notice that. And this is happening in our community, so in Centre Wellington. So it's going to be a daunting task for our council. I call our council the Planning Council. We are planning for the next 25 years. We're setting the table. We're putting the boundaries there. We're looking at sort of all the plan. We've had to elevate all our planning documents. It's a crazy task. And it's not just in our community. It's happening in little communities all around the GTA. Everyone is dealing with that. The one thing that really doesn't get talked about is agricultural land. If you've been to our community, we have the best agricultural land in North America. And we're looking at exterminating possibly 2,600 acres of that beautiful agricultural land. That land is for you guys. It feeds you. It feeds Ontario. It feeds the world. We need to be smarter about how we deal with agricultural land. We need to have good policies about agricultural land. Right now, they suck. We need to be, there's 2 things. We have housing. We understand that. We're going to do our job to provide the amount of housing that we need to do our job that way. We also need to protect the agricultural land. So things like intensification, going up, grandmother suites, micro homes. We're looking at all those things. We want to take that 2,600 acres and reduce it to 1,000 acres. And even that is killing us to be able to accommodate 30,000 people. But we're doing that. We're trying to do that. Government needs to have better policies in terms of intensification. We know you guys have good intensification policies, but in the rural area, there's really none. So we need to be able to do that because we're going to continue to lose that agricultural piece. And we need water, we need agriculture, and we need housing. And actually, that's in the order that we need them in. So it's really important that we need all these things, but they have to work together. So, in order to reduce our urban sprawl, we need to be smarter about it. I know folks like myself are continually lobbying the government to look at better agricultural policies, but whoever is in government in the next 2 years from now, in my mind, the party that's going to get in power is going to have great agricultural policies. People are tired of just going at it and just saying, let's make it happen. Can appreciate the work that you did on Greenbelt in terms of saying enough is enough. But we need to be able to look at agricultural policies in a way that makes sense. We also need to accept the fact that it has to work with the housing component. So there's got to be ways of doing this through intensification, smarter planning, good policies, protective countryside. We need to bring all these together, and these are the types of things that we're going to need for the next 25, 30 years, and we need to really set the tone of that now. So I'm going to get off my high horse. That's enough for I'll call it my rural mouse banter. I do want to recognize a few people as a politician, and I get to do this a little bit, but I do want to recognize a few politicians here as well, or ex-politicians. I really feel privileged to be in this group. So at first I'd like to recognize Art Eglinton. Okay, from 1980 to 1991, was the mayor of Toronto. Art was also an MP, Parliament from 1993 to 2004, and he was a senator from 2005 to 2018. I don't think Alvin Tejo is here. He's a potential future mayor. So we're slagging with mayors here tonight. But Alvin is a Ward 2 councillor in Mississauga, and I think he's on his way, who's presently running for mayor of Mississauga. And then finally, I would like to introduce David Crombie. David has served as mayor of Toronto from 1972 to 1978, member of Parliament from 1978 to 1988, federal cabinet minister. He was also served as president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, chair of Ontario Place, founding chair of the Waterfront Regeneration Trust, and chancellor of Ryerson University. He recently left his gig at the Greenbelt Council, and I think we all knew why, and the Toronto Lands Corporation, and recently chaired the advisory panel for coordinated land and land use planning review. He's a member of the Order of Ontario and an officer of the Order of Canada, and he's also a tireless advocate for the City of Toronto. I'd like to welcome up to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Sean. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank the organizers for the invitation to come tonight, see so many people, and some old veterans I hadn't seen, some old warriors that I hadn't seen for some time. The only change I would make in the general introduction is that it was reported I was 80 years old. I'm 88 this year. And when I was 80, I looked like Art Eglinton. But I want to thank you for the introduction, Sean. It was nice to hear. Let me also say that when I was asked if I would come, I generally speaking try and restrict. Well, I have daughters, and they restrict on my behalf appearances that I make and the things that I do. But of course, the topic you have tonight and the issues that you'll be contemplating are really important. So I thought the least I could do is show up. Let me start by using a quote from Don Iveson, speaking of mayors, former mayor of Edmonton, and co-chair of a recent task force on housing. And he had this to say about housing, very quickly. The housing crisis in Canada has taken on a life of its own. And the issue is so massive, so unwieldy, it seems almost impossible to contend with. Now that's a quote he made just a couple of weeks ago, and it follows the work that he did with the task force. So we should take his thought, I think, really seriously. And if you look at the data that we can scare up from anywhere these days, the housing situation in Canada is in some ways, oddly enough, because it looks better, but it's in worse shape than very often we've had in the past. The price of housing has gone up 140% in 20 years. It's gone up 50% since the pandemic. The qualifying income for people to buy a house these days is gone through the roof. And the ability to pay rent is now sucking up somewhere in the order of 60% of people's income. Don't have any doubt whatsoever about the seriousness of the issue of affordable housing in this country. Now, it's something that we should pay attention to, because mostly it has to do with the fact that it didn't happen by some kind of magic. It didn't happen by indirection. It didn't happen by direction. We just didn't care enough, I think, for the last 25 years to invest in affordable housing. And that's why today we have an affordable housing problem, because we didn't invest in it. We thought other ways were better. And so what happened, of course, is that we ended up with not enough housing. And to our shame, we now have a homelessness issue in cities across the land that we didn't have before. So I wanted to emphasize the importance of the topic. You knew it, but when you hear it so stark, it reminds you how important it is. So it's important, of course, then, I think, and I'm one of those, who welcome the report at the federal task force report on housing and climate change. Its subtitle was a blueprint for more and better housing, and it has I think it's somewhere around 170, 175 recommendations. Well worth your attention. If you haven't had a chance to get a copy of it, you should get a copy of it. It'll tell you where we are and where we probably need to go. What it does is outline the problems we have and offers some clear solutions. And for example, right at the start, it says, look, here's a picture of what we need to build, where we need to build it, how we need to build it, and why we're building it. And here are some foundation issues you can use to get the job on its way. It also announces certain goals that it has that we can share. Goals for making sure we're building as we try and catch up with housing, that we're building with the understanding of making it low carbon in mind, that needs to have a sense of resilience to deal with climate change, that needs to be affordable, and it needs to be inclusive, and we need to spend our time working on how we get it done. It's pretty clear, we need places to live, and we need healthy communities to live in. And therefore, the whole point of trying to get it done is what the task force itself spends time at. There is, of course, all other, I should have mentioned, it's not just this report. You would know if you're interested in the literature or pay any attention to the issues of affordable housing, that there have been just a legion number of studies and by organizations and task forces and community organizations and so on. And so the notion that somehow we can simply do it on our own, we need to pay far more attention to. If you take all those issues and suggestions being made, I think in the order, a friend of mine was doing some work on all the work, all the reports that have been done the last couple of years, comes to the number 35. And if you look at the knuckles of what they're saying, here's what they're saying we need to do. One, and you'll like this, Mr. Mayor. Number one, we need to increase density in existing urban areas. These are obvious things that most of you would know. But it's worthwhile noting that if we just look at them and put them in the fist. The first one, increased density in existing urban areas, that has three really important things. One, it limits the continuation of urban sprawl, the very costly urban sprawl. Secondly, it supports our natural assets and natural processes, because it's important to do so in order to carry out our responsibilities for environmental health. And what it also does, thirdly, is supports farmland, agriculture efficiency, and food security. It also calls for not just that study, not task force study, but all of them. They call for a transit-oriented, mixed-use, and mixed-income housing. We need to make sure that we are breathing life into the old understanding of how we built affordable housing, and that was through public and private nonprofits, co-ops, etc. The missing middle, as we now call it, needs to be understood and worked on. There are people in the audience today who are working on WeHousing to make sure that we've got a range of choices and opportunities for all kinds of people. We need to lever some way the use of land that has already been allocated for building and is not being built on. That's some people call the use it or lose it. We need to pay attention to the quality of community life that we're building when we build housing. There are some people who argue that it's not important to worry about community when we're building the housing. It's clear to me, and I think to most people, when you create housing, you create community. The only question is whether it's a livable community or not. And finally, we need to pay attention to evolving really strong. You can see it as you walk the streets or drive your car. We need to look at the changes that are already occurring in single-family dwelling neighborhoods and in shopping centers around the province. They're now looking for places where they can put residences. So all of those things are the guts of what we need to be doing. And I don't think any of that was a surprise to any of you. Let me, if I could, spend the last little bit of time that I have by as we go forward, offering 3 thoughts that might be useful. And they actually come, I didn't think these up, they come from experience in the past. I've been through what we called housing crises in the past and had to take some actions. There are always going to be differences of opinion, but these are 3 things that I learned, and I passed them on for whatever value they may be. First of all, you always have to be, because the road gets hard and there are different opinions and you get tired and all of that. But you should never, ever forget, you should always be mindful of the importance of what we're doing in the building of affordable housing. The current situation that we have is destructive of both community and individual lives. We have home and community, the idea of home and community is fundamental to the basic questions that we have as human beings in life. There are three basic questions that we all ask ourselves as we go through the life stages. Who am I? Where do I belong? How do I behave? And the answers to those questions change as you go through the life cycle. You ask them when you're 6. You ask them when you're 26. You ask them when they're 46. I can tell you, you ask them when you're 86. And the answers always change. And therefore, the needs always change. The second thing to remember is that you should always be moving forward with vigor and purpose and urgency. You can't wait around. Doesn't mean you become inefficient. Doesn't mean you don't worry about important things. It does mean you should do things with a sense of urgency. Time is already up for many people, and they're hurting. Delay easily becomes denial, and processes overdone can smother both policy and product. So, thirdly, let me say, we do need, at all times, sometimes it doesn't work that way, but at the end of the day, for sure, we need everybody on deck, all hands on deck. We don't need single combat warriors who've got the idea that only they understand and everybody else should follow. We don't need people who are looking for scapegoats, and we don't need people who want to blame others. That all makes the papers, but it doesn't make a house. And so it's important that we recognize that at the end of the day, it's what we need most are places to live and healthy communities to live in. And in order to do that, we need partnerships. We need partnerships between levels of government, community groups, and the people who actually build things, the development industry. So when somebody comes to me and says, here's what I want to do, I'm the government here, I'm the level of government, this level of government, my question to them, well, who are your partners? If you don't have the partners, all of it is simply talk. So thanks for having me here. I hope I wasn't too stern. Thanks very much. Am I dismissed?
Yes. You are dismissed for now, but we will have some time after with the panel Q&A. When you're asking questions, you can also address your questions to Mr. Crombie at that time. Thank you very much, Mr. Crombie, for sharing your insightful thoughts and your experiences and resources and things that we will all keep in mind as we go forward. Great context, and it also helps to illustrate the complexity of our upcoming conversation. So let's meet the panel, shall we? Here they are. First, I will start with our moderator this evening is Alex Bozakovic. He's the architecture critic for the Globe and Mail, an author and/or editor of 3 books, Toronto Architecture, A City Guide, House Divided, and the bestseller 305 Lost Buildings of Canada. Alex won the 2019 President's Medal for Media in Architecture from the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada in his journalism. And for our panelists, Dr. Diane Sachs is the current Toronto City Councillor for Ward 11. Before working for the government sector, Diane ran an environmental law boutique firm and was ranked among the top 25 environmental lawyers in the world. Diane has been the recipient of several awards, most recently an honorary Doctor of Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo in 2022. She holds fellowships at Massey College and Osgoode Hall Law School. Next we have Nama Blonder. Nama has a bold vision to change what good housing can and should look like in a growing city like Toronto. With that in mind, she co-founded Smart Density. Her professional practice combines the disciplines of architecture, urban planning, and urban design to bring a deeper, more realistic understanding of how cities can address housing affordability and champion inclusive neighborhoods with more equitable access to housing. Next, we have Mark Ryan. Mark is a landscape architect with a focus on the design of cities. With 25 years of practice in Canada, the United States, and Europe, he has dedicated his passion, advocacy, and professional work towards elevating the role of landscape and the public realm in shaping the quality of urban environments. John Van Nostrand. John is the founding principal of SVN with over 4 decades of architecture, planning, and urban design practice. He is recognized worldwide for his expertise in the planning and design of affordable housing and community infrastructure, as well as transportation and transit infrastructure. Having received numerous national and international awards, including the World Leadership Award for Town Planning, Daniel Burnham Award from the American Planning Association, and the World Habitat Award from UN Habitat. And finally, but not leastly, which is not a word, but finally, Antonio Gomez Palacio is internationally recognized for transforming cities into vibrant urban places that respond to their social, economic, and environmental context. As partner and dialogue chair, his mission is to deliver design solutions to the many global challenges. He is frequently called upon to lead conversations on how the built environment can contribute to community well-being. Antonio became Fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada College in 2018, and when he was recognized for his outstanding contributions to the design community. So at this time, I welcome all our panelists and moderator, please, to the stage. And if I got any of those details wrong, I will say, I've only been back for 2 days. I'm sorry, mea culpa. Please correct yourselves and make your bios known when you're on the stage. Thank you very much. And we will have a Q&A at the end. Thomas, the mics are not on. He's on it. Always know the name of the IT. Very good.
Hello. There we go. Hi. We've crafted this event very carefully on this panel, clearly. Maybe we should just loop across the panel and everyone can just say their names so that everyone knows who is speaking, because we were all hiding in the front row when we were being introduced. Or perhaps I can do that. Antonio?
Antonio?
Nama? Mark? Diane? And the legend, John Van Nostrand. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, OALA, for having me as your moderator. This is a panel full of knowledge and wisdom, and it's fantastic to be part of this event. Also to have heard those wise words from David Crombie. And I hope that David Crombie's words about how housing and community are interlinked will sort of be a through line for us tonight. So we're here to talk about housing and the relationship between housing and landscape and how we can address the housing crisis while also creating beautiful landscapes that work, and also I think what role perhaps landscape architects can play in addressing both the issue of the housing crisis and creating better places at the same time. So that's where I hope to go tonight. Perhaps we can start with a general question and talk about that relationship between landscape and housing. What is the importance of landscapes, and can you perhaps talk about that in a specific way? What is a place in which a particular landscape has created community or has helped create a more beautiful and a more hospitable city? Antonio, do you want to start?
Sure. So I come at it from a practice in architecture, landscape architecture, engineering, and urban planning, urban design. So clearly we're often confronted with the notion that we have zero control over the price at which a housing unit goes out into the market. So the big question for us, as you're opening the door for, is how can we contribute in meaningful ways into this conversation? And in my mind, and clearly looking at the cost of a household, housing is a huge component. But so is access to affordable recreation, access to affordable transportation, access to affordable healthcare, childcare, all of these other factors. So we have, as a collective, and as David Crombie pointed at us, this takes a collective effort. It takes all of us working together to really be able to create those environments that are going to address affordability and equity and access in the multiplicity of ways. And the public realm plays a huge role in that. Because this is the commons. This is the place where there's a shared economy, where we're actually supporting each other, where we're creating affordable access, not just to the recreation in the public realm, but to the social capital, to the ability for us to engage as a community and support each other. So every one of those tentacles is actually having a positive impact on the household income, on the household affordability, on all of those other fronts. So clearly those environments that have a robust public realm, right, that have a beautiful, engaging, healthy public realm are going to be supporting the ability for a community to be equally healthy, engaging, and mutually supportive.
Well said. Thank you. Nama.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think when we named our company Smart Density, it's because, unfortunately, there's also examples of dumb density, which is, for me, smart density is, first of all, multi-family. When you refer to the latest report by the Minister Fraser task force, and what I took from it is not only how we build, but I would say even point number one is where we build and how we make sure that we actually grow inwards. And we hear all about housing. We need more housing. We need more housing. No one, do people think that it's actually going to be houses with sprawl? And I unfortunately, I think that many Canadians still define the affordability crisis as the lack of ability to own a house. I have news for you. Our generation, this is not an option, and it won't, and it shouldn't. What I'm not hearing enough, not from politicians, not from leaders, not from chief planners, is the type of housing that we need. And in Toronto, Laneway Suite is not the type of housing that we need. We need more apartments, more multi-unit, near transit. We need to invest. We have a very long catch-up in transit that we need to do. So going back to the smart density definition, it all comes down to livability, an amazing public realm, and to make sure that this lifestyle of living in an apartment or in a condo is so much more attractive than the house somewhere remotely, So it's our job to make sure that this is a much more attractive lifestyle than the other, because again, it's not about having a house with a red roof and a white fence.
So the public realm has to be better than the private backyard.
Yes.
Okay. Mark, how do we get there?
Yeah, in a way, there's the landscape of housing, but I think I'd like to sort of connect to the bigger scale of the landscape of the city, and how that perspective, I think, of the whole is so critical in the conversation, and how that filters down to the specific sites of housings and the spaces of housings and their interrelationships. I think that connection from the larger urban systems, the landscapes of the city, down to the housing unit, and that connection and often disconnection is, I think, a really key part of the conversation. In some ways, nature and landscape has often been thought of as an antidote to the city, and I think we can think about it in a more contemporary way as a framework for cities, and how landscape systems, the ability to apply landscape thinking to urban contexts, and sort of to adopt an urban mindset in thinking about landscape is, I think, really important. And it connects with what you're saying, Naima, about the idea of urbanization being simply a force of growth, but the idea of making a city being actually something that's very conscious. It involves values, as David Crombie suggests, And it evolves the idea that you're aiming for something, and there's an idea in place that you're aiming for, and it's a collective idea. And we always need and must sustain the public dimension to every element that is part of it. And yeah, and of course it's extremely complex system, and that's sort of part of this, the magnitude of this challenge is because it's so many, there's never one single lever here.
Thank you. Diane.
One of the reasons that City Council in Toronto the Good finally managed to allow alcohol in parks is that for many of us, large numbers of our constituents no longer have private outdoor space. And the park is the only place for especially young people to go to have time with their friends outdoors. That's one tiny piece of this larger picture, and as you know, Alex, I am always working to have public space better than private backyards, but I do it for a different reason. Nobody here has mentioned that we are in a climate crisis. You should all be talking about climate when you talk about housing. It makes no sense at all to talk about building housing without remembering the carbon footprint of everything that goes into that housing, the carbon footprint of the space that we use for housing, and how that housing is going to operate. So I had a couple of slides that were up before from a talk I gave at the Carbon Leadership Forum, which draws on the research from the University of Toronto's Centre for the Sustainable Built Environment. But the gist is, if we take even halfway seriously our desire to have, say, a 50-50 chance of a livable future for anybody younger than me, which is most of you, then we have to be getting to net zero as a country by, at the latest, 2040. And if we want to do that, then the amount of carbon emissions from building materials has to plunge, and building the way our current premier is driving us to build is going to dramatically explode the carbon footprint of the materials in the buildings, plus all the damage from building sprawl. The only way we can have enough housing and a half-decent chance at a livable climate future is to make much smaller housing, close together, never build another single-family home, and we can only expect people to live close together in small spaces if we have excellent public spaces, public services, public infrastructure, and that's what I'm fighting for every day.
Thank you. John.
Thanks, Alex. Is that on? Yeah, yeah. I kind of think the answer is really happening right in this room. You know, my aunt gave me a photo once of my grandfather sitting on the steps of a building at U of T, and with 30 other men, and a little sign down the floor said SPSS. And I said, well, there's something wrong here because he's a surveyor. He was a well-known surveyor. And he was in engineering. What is this? He said, well, it's a school of practical studies. Well, what the hell is a school of practical studies? I looked it up. Oh, it was a school where engineers, architects, landscape architects, planners, surveyors all worked in the same faculty. And that was profoundly different than we've experienced since then. Everybody splitting off and arguing that they're the most important part of that team. And it's destroyed lots. I mean, it's destroyed relationships with landscape. It hasn't helped the housing situation at all. And I'd just like to say that I'd like to congratulate the OALA for stepping out publicly and bringing people together around this issue, but just professionally. I'll tell you that at my firm we have 30 architects, which is about a quarter of the firm. And we have all the other professions as well. And I can't imagine working any other way than we've been working. And I think it's turned out pretty well. And again, delighted to be here.
Thanks, John. So we have, to recap so far, we've heard about interdisciplinarity. We've heard about the importance of public space to address the emerging reality that certainly in this city, people will be living at close quarters and need to do so for a variety of reasons, and should be able to do that in a way that is beautiful, in a way that is pleasant. I'm sure everyone in the room is on board with that goal as well. So let's talk about specifics. Where are some places, again, keeping in mind that we have a room full of landscape architects outside of the stage anyway, where are some of the places in which this profession could make some meaningful interventions? Where would you begin?
How about our playgrounds? Our playgrounds are awful. We have, it's one of the constant frustrations of my life. I've got 6 grandsons, and finding a playground for a 3-year-old, no problem. Finding a playground that's interesting for a 9 or 10-year-old, impossible. We have no interesting, or almost no interesting places for older kids, much less teenagers, much less young adults, especially not young women. And come on, folks, surely you can do better. I keep hearing that the public spaces, the playgrounds in Europe are amazing. I see the pictures, I hear the stories, and then I look at what we've got and I weep. Help.
I think we've actually not recognized what's going on here in terms of nature and landscape. That being, the British recognized it very, very well in their colonization, and that is, so we're in our case, we have a city on the largest, one of the largest lakes in North America in the world, and we have, and never have had, any relationship with it. And it's getting worse. We have beautiful valleys that run through, and yes, I know we all walked on them but they're all backed onto. They're not leftover. They're really where homeless people and gays who got kicked out of bars used to hang out because there was no constituency. My children weren't allowed to go down there at certain points. And I think we have a lot of undoing to do to bring back a landscape which we actually are not very familiar with, our own landscape. And it's full of diversity, certainly green, and it's an amazing challenge to kind of work on that.
Antonio.
The World Economic Forum put out a challenge last month, which I'll throw into this room now in answer to your question, which is, what would happen if we designed the city from the perspective of a woman on a bike? Just think about that. Forget about everything else. And all the other priorities that we do, if we really designed it from a gender base and from somebody on a bicycle, what would happen, right? And it's really the notion of flipping the priorities, but also flipping the perspective, right? Pick the 880 cities of Gail Peñalosa, right? The perspective from a child or a senior. But at a certain point, we also need to start to really rethink the eyes through which we make decisions.
Thank you.
Woman on a bike every day. I like that.
Mark.
I think it's really interesting how what's the simple challenge of making a great public space in a city has grown increasingly more complex because of the fact that we have a rapidly growing city and there's no more vacant land. And so what's interesting is the constraint that puts upon designers, all designers, in a multidisciplinary way, to think about expanded ideas of public realm and to go beyond the conventions. We unfortunately, although Centre Wellington has a Central Park en masse of, it's hard to find 800 acres in the city of Toronto. So one of the, I think, fascinating ways of, as all the landscape professionals in this room will understand, is that ability to sort of take a second look at your city, to look at that terrain in a new way, and to actually recognize that with the constraints that we have today, there are a whole new set of opportunities. And it means, every city comes to a point of time, I think, in its life where it has to use its resources more deliberately, more intensively, and with intention. And I think today, like in Toronto, we experience that. It means our roads cannot simply be conduits for cars. We have 600 acres of streets in downtown Toronto. So that's a huge public resource, and that has to be completely reimagined and rethought to deliver some of the things you're talking about, quality of life and the sort of the front doors of where people live. You could take that to you can take that across all the complex infrastructure that puts together a city, and you could take a landscape sensibility, and if we just move to the sort of edges of our profession and the intersection with other things like infrastructure, like housing, and all those realms, that those realms can cohere, and they can cohere by an integrated way of thinking, and the opportunities are for play, for example, Diane, will be completely different because they may take place in venues that are not traditional. And actually those could be incredibly exciting. So in some ways, there's a fear of density, but there's also a huge potential that density enables when integrated and formally thought and carefully thought and woven into our fabric.
What is that potential? Nama, you want to?
No, I was waiting to be the last one because I wanted to say streets and I want to talk about bike lanes, but I also want you to know that Toronto is an amazing city, and we do and did so many things so well. I wasn't born here. I'm well traveled. We just the guy who's taking a photo of us. We just came back from a conference of IMBY in Austin. I was, for the first time this year, in Los Angeles, first and last. We are getting things right. We also love to critique ourselves, which is a good thing. We love to improve ourselves, but because Toronto was built so recently, so many things are brand new and are built to the high quality and the high standard that back, specifically from in the Middle East, you can only dream of having a public realm to this extent. Also in Austin, it doesn't exist in Toronto. We took an electric scooter, which is a woman on a bike. A scooter is known to be, like I think, 78% male users. And that's the only reason I agreed to Mark, like I need to fight this, to fight this and get on a scooter to make sure I am changing the percentage. It was my first time. Mark was like ahead of me, like few intersections every time. But I think we are, I think we should know how well we did get things here. So just to conclude this.
It's helpful. I think that's a very helpful perspective because it is easy to forget in this local conversation in Toronto how many things do have gone right here. And thanks, Mr. Crombie, among others. But let's go outside of Toronto, please. I want to talk about streets and talk about the realm in which landscape architects can intervene. If Centre Wellington is going to be paving 1,000 acres of farmland, which may unfortunately be the case, how can the new housing that is created in suburban zones and the housing that already exists in car-oriented suburbs, how can the landscape in those areas function better as social spaces, as ecological spaces, as spaces for play? Ideas?
So clearly the walkability is a huge unlocking potential in all of this, right? As long as we're always thinking of those streets as perceived as 80 kilometers an hour, we're not going to have that potential. We need to be, forget 1 kilometer an hour. When I was walking my kids back from daycare a decade and a half ago, it was like 3 hours for the 1 kilometer, right? No. So being able to not only experience it at that scale, that's when that fine grainness happens. But in order to do that, you need the density. You need the critical mass of population to achieve the vision that you're trying to achieve. You also need now the safety, but not just in a perspective of free from crime or from being run over. You need the equity. You need the ability for people to truly be in a space where they can feel included, right? And then you need the multi-generational. You need all of those aspects coming together so that kid walking back from daycare can run around with a fair bit of ease and at the same time interact with others. And the senior can be caught when they're having a bad day and all of those aspects. So the design of the public realm is not simply the creation of an environment where people engage. It's actually the enabling of all of those social interactions that are going to be truly mutually supportive.
Well, I just want to say that you kind of went to global examples, Alex. Like, and I think that's there's so much we can learn from streets, and it's sort of, there's great examples all over the world. But in some ways, what I think is a really interesting challenge for Toronto, for every city, is to how to make those, to learn from those global examples, but how to make them specific to the place. And so the idea that every street isn't equal, and streets take you somewhere. And to really understand each street, not generically, but to apply all the positive principles that, like Antonio's touching on, in terms of walkability, grain, texture, like speed, comfort, outdoor comfort, all-season play, all these things. But these are almost the least we can do with all of our professionalism. But I think to rise above that, to be constantly thinking how the public realm shapes the experience and identity of a particular place. So to think about University Avenue is very different from Queen Street. It's different from College, Bloor, and Queens Quay. So to think about our network and where they take us, and in Toronto, for example, that they often take us to our ravines, or they take us places, and they take us to parks, they take us to schools, and to start to thinking of the interconnection of all things, again, as like being very tuned to the specifics of place. So that we're not just making great streets, we're actually we're actually getting closer to the city, the unique qualities of the city that is particular.
Thanks, John.
I think one example that's really interesting and that is relevant to us is what happened after the British enclosures. That period ended when the estates, huge estates, have been enclosed to improve their agricultural production, et cetera, et cetera. And along came Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton and those people who said, hey, we have to remake the landscape you've taken away from us. So that, of course, is then when our guy, Olmsted, went over and studied all those intimately, spent years there, and came back and copied them in a brilliant way. I mean, go to Cleveland if you want to see what you do with valleys. Olmsted, all the valleys are the major public spaces of the city. At the top of each one is a major institution. It's Buffalo even, it's fantastic, and as I know said. So I think you can't be afraid of inventing nature. That there's some kind of holy thing about it. You can make it better than it was, or you can replace it, and that's got to be gutsy, not just be put down because you're changing things as they are.
Interesting. So we have the idea that of inventing or reinventing nature can be beneficial, socially beneficial, and also that having more people in a city, having density allows the creation of projects that have design projects that can be more special, that can be more particular, that can be in some ways better, but also that the public realm and streets are not necessarily just places to get around, but also places to be, and places that have particular qualities, each of them individually. Interesting set of ideas. So let's back up and talk a little bit more about the sort of the politics of housing, because I don't want to get entirely away from the frame that was given to our event here. In our conversation in Ontario, let's say, as we are, and countrywide, as we are grappling with a response to the ongoing shortage of housing in this country, where are the big opportunities now to make changes for what is probably going to be a denser and more closely packed country, a more urbanized country? I'm sorry to use a more straightforward term. Where are the interventions now specifically that landscape can make to take us through the next generation of intensification, urbanization, coming together? Anybody?
The first one, with all due respect, is we should not convert another single acre of farmland to suburbs. we should not pave another acre of farmland. That farmland is irreplaceable. It's going to be harder and harder to grow food. We're already seeing the cost of food rising around the world. It's going to get harder and harder to grow food. And soil takes tens of thousands of years. We can't afford to pave farmland for 100 different reasons. The single most important thing to do is to prevent the expansion of urban boundaries. I did a whole report on that when I was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, and Mr. Ford, of course, going exactly in the opposite direction on every possible occasion. But then from a political point of view, it's very, very difficult to intensify. And this is my ward right here. Welcome to my ward, everybody. This is a beautiful area. The annex just north of here, it's recognized as one of the best places to live in the world. It is one of the best places to live in the world, but it's one of the best places to live in the world for reasons that are very hard to sustain. There are high-quality transit. We've got a subway system with very large capacity. We've got trees, we've got parks, and we've got mostly low-rise housing. And that is now in the meat grinder because we have immense pressure. We're not going to expand urban boundaries. We've got to put people within the urban boundaries, and we want to put them near transit. We want to put them near transit. I've got more subway stations in my ward than any other place in the city. So where should you put people? Near the subway stations. What's near the subway stations? These irreplaceable neighborhoods. If we fill them full of apartment buildings, it's not going to be the annex anymore. It's not going to be the quality of life that the people who are here want and that the people who want to come want. So there is a huge conflict there. Another really difficult problem that I haven't seen anybody suggest a solution to is the balance between individual design and which is interesting, right? If every house is individually designed, it's more interesting to walk by, the streetscape is more lively, but it's impossibly expensive to retrofit. Right? Retrofits only make financial sense if you can do it on a bulk basis. A bulk basis only works if we have standardized urban forms. If we have standardized urban forms, how do we have interesting streetscapes? So I haven't seen anybody working really hard on bringing together the kind of work Ralph Torrey did on how we scale up retrofits by standardizing, and Jane Jacobs' views about the interest and the variety and which was people prize in this area right now. So again, if you guys have good ideas, let me know.
Well, when was it, Alex, when you and I were on the previous panel, when one of the panelists suggested that Toronto is already dense enough, we're built out, and we should really direct immigrants and whatever that was.
The Malta Wellington.
Yeah.
Should go somewhere else.
And actually, it is shocking, and it was also quite surprising to hear the mayor of Central Wellington saying that without transit is the foundation for anything we should do. I don't know how you can intensify without transit. It sounds like a recipe for a problem. But if you're asking about new ideas, Toronto is not dense enough. Like, I don't know, when was the last time you went on a flight somewhere on an airplane, and you can see it from so clearly. It is very low rise with, I don't know, Yonge Street. That's basically what you see. And that is a problem. And to think, I had a project, just because Councillor Sachs mentioned that, with the Residents Association of the Annex. Anyone had the pleasure?
Fun.
Fun. I remember it very vividly, and not because it was fun. And it was, I actually got involved as the architect after the Residents Association blocked the development, and we're talking about a 4-story, 39 rental unit. That was the high density version that they wanted to block, and they did it by designating the 2 buildings as heritage buildings. Sounds like a really good recipe. So you know, just because you brought up the annex as an example and the quality of life, everyone in that residence association was, I don't know, my parents' age. I think that's fair to say. And I don't know, are we thinking of future generations when we are making those decisions, when we have the residence association fighting any new development? And by the way, that residence association had a very high number of architects, our colleagues, planners, lawyers, who work in that industry for a living and know all the rules and how to pivot it around them when they want to. So I want to argue about the annex and
Well, I'll take you up on that. John, I know you're jumping at the bit, but I live in a neighborhood not very far from here, and a number of neighbors are currently organizing against an 8-unit apartment building, and the people organizing against that include a professor of planning and a prominent environmental advocate. So it's an uncomfortable conversation that I...
And they came to another friend came to me with a WhatsApp group that they opened, and he said, look at us, this is community. It's like, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Fighting housing is community?
Yeah, fighting housing is, look at us, all of us coming together on this WhatsApp group.
And they fight equally fiercely against intensifying low-rise and replacing existing high-rise. They fight all of it.
Almost as if nothing should happen at all in their neighborhoods or our neighborhoods. I mean, clearly, I don't think we have a lot of disagreement on this panel on that point. John, you look like you've been raring to jump in. What would you like to add?
Holding this here, but I've always got something to say. But I think you have to decide what of existing nature you really rely on and want to see kept. What inventive architecture, what inventive landscape you can add to it. And then you have to build it so nobody can fucking take it down. And look at Paris. I mean, I'm sorry to use an obvious example, but that whole system of greenways, which went along, everybody else always talks about Haussmann. It was Alphonse who made Paris. And he made spaces that you couldn't get rid of. You just, you'd be politically dead. And now they've added whatever it was, I forgot the number, 150,000 other people just before the Olympics to the city without having to touch anything green and closing a few streets.
So I know some people in the room. I know, Paul, you know Sonny Tamak, urban designer in the city of Calgary, and he's from Zagreb. And I've heard him give a talk describing to folks in prairie cities, saying, calm down. Like Zagreb, a 2,000-year-old city, Paris, 2,000-year-olds, they're still designing it, right? The majority of our cities are 100, 150 years old, the density that you see right now. Calm down, right? We're only on the first sketch of what the city looks like, right? We're starting, don't think about it as too precious, right? We need to keep on working on this, right? It will be many generations. This idea that Toronto's built out, no, we're just getting started. We're sketching it out. We're learning as we go. And I'll pull the thread of the word politics that you used, because in that transition, I think one of the big shifts is moving away from the capital P politics and assuming that the policymakers are going to be directing how people live, to the small p politics. And it's not the NIMBY part. But I had a municipal planner in a smaller community once tell me that they did greenfields because it was easier, right? So I've taken that as an assumption, that meaning if we're doing complex, if you're having those difficult conversations, if you're engaged in riddled environments where it's politicized, where it's lots of opinions, we're probably doing a good thing. Right. We're probably exactly in the space that is about intensification, that is about transformation, that is about evolving now the next 100 and 1,000 years for that city space.
And how can design, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of visionary projects that can reshape the city, because particularly with landscape, this is not a city, Toronto is not a city that has a lot of big gestures in it. And indeed, there are a few of the older cities in this province have, big parks or big squares, big urban design gestures, as does Guelph, for instance. But on the whole, our urbanism tends to be kind of incremental. It kind of just happened without a lot of vision. So perhaps we can, Mark, do you want to tell us a little bit about University Park, which many people will be familiar with, and what the ambitions that you and your clients and that the City of Toronto are bringing to this thing? You know, what is it, and how might that kind of a landscape intervention change the character of a city?
Sure. I mean, this is kind of like a project in the simplest form. It's just really taking advantage of what is already there and already public. We have a University Avenue that connects from Bloor down to Front, and currently, it has an idea about the public realm that isn't totally serving the community that's changing around it. It's intensifying, and simply by reformatting the shape of the street, the order of an organization of traffic, we can unlock basically the huge capacity and potential of the environment itself and the environments it connects. So by simply converting effectively 9.5 acres of asphalt along lanes of street, we can connect what amounts to a 90-acre connected open space system. And that system includes parts of the U of T, Queen's Park, and all the way down what would become a linear park down University Avenue to Osgoode Hall and connect to City Hall. So it's just about, I think it's less important as an individual project, which would, I think, be transformative and would help, a changing part of the city, but it's more about a way of thinking about how we can start to think about the kind of connective quality of landscapes, the kind of binding and coherence that can happen that pull together many disparate parts into something more tangible as a whole.
Binding quality of landscape, you said. So what's conceptually significant here is the idea that you have a number of places that are already important or that are known, but by reshaping the roads and creating connections between them where people can walk and that feel like public space that's meant to be occupied, that these turn into something bigger. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of that's the big idea about how you can unlock a whole series of potential without having, 100 acres of vacant land, right? It's a totally different way, I think, of thinking about how urbanity and landscape systems can be intermingled. And so I think that's a different, I think it's more fluid, and I think it's also more natural. It also allows the best of urbanity, the vibrancy of public life, to have more venues that have different characters and atmospheres. And as you move through a city, those atmospheres and experiences can change, which is, I think, what's fascinating about living in a city and have districts that feel distinct. Like the cities that are memorable, you feel those changes happen as you move to different parts of the city.
And the one that's next going to show up at City Council, and it's flying a little bit under the radar screen, is the Scarborough Transit Line, right? The decommissioning of this line. It's once in a generation that a community gets a chance at being able to have a large-scale, interconnected public park in areas that already have the transit-oriented developed density in those environments, right? We cannot let these opportunities slide by.
Well, I'm going to be writing about that shortly. So
we just voted to have a study.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Sorry, Mark, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that there's something about, it's kind of going back maybe to your previous question about the change of cities and how cities are evolving and how they're constant, like there's no static city, there's like they are alive. But I think one thing that somehow when we feel the pressure, public, like in governance or in public, when we feel that pressure, somehow we resort to the things we know. And I think it's hard in any city, but for example, even cities with very strong and rich urban traditions, like in European countries, in other places, it's still hard to make change. But nevertheless, we can watch Paris reinvent itself. We can watch New York reinvent itself. So Toronto can do the same, but in some ways, our sensibilities often resorts to more suburban ideas and about distancing, about spreading out, about buffers, about claiming individual space rather than collective space. So some of it is about Toronto totally embracing the fact that it's a city and it's a big city and it can be an amazing city, and it needs to be more woven with its incredible resources, including the valley, its waterfronts, its neighborhoods, its landscapes, and that more people will enrich it.
Well, it seems to me the one thing that is emerging from this is a theme that I've become aware of in the last few years, which is the fact that we tend to, in our society, isolate landscape. We tend to isolate public parks. We don't want commerce in parks. We don't want private buildings to interface directly with parks. Parks should be off by themselves somewhere, whether they're natural in character or whether they're intended for recreation. Antonio, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Am I correct in noting that as a sort of cultural moray, and is that one that we should pull apart?
Yeah, I mean, potentially. There's so many great examples. I'm thinking of the Arbutus Corridor in Vancouver, right? The Cuernavaca Corridor in Mexico City, right? Different environments where literally lost space or wasted space with a little bit of reimagination become real social catalysts, right? And a real opportunity. And now you go to the Arbutus Corridor and there's everything from berry picking to pollinator friendly, everything, right? To a real social interactions. And it's become a catalyst for all kinds of community types of initiatives. So yes, big advocate of reinventing some of these spaces. A generation ago, it was the portlands that were coming up. A decade ago, it was the malls that we were starting to reinvent. Today, it's derelict office spaces and parking structures, right? So every decade, there's these spaces that come up in our cities for us to reinvent and really have an opportunity to reintroduce them into the public sphere.
Antonio, it's so powerful and so important, and that it can be a creative task, this reintegration and this like hybridizing, basically. I mean, this is what, to me, this is what Toronto is just starting to do, and which is so exciting. It's starting, like projects like the Brickworks would not have, that took decades to make, but we finally reach a density where we can have a hub like that in our valley. So we can, it changes our way of thinking. To start to think about, mixity in every sense of the word, coexistence in every sense. And it's so powerful. And I think of David, the work Mr. Crombie did on the Kings, just the idea of how you transform King Street by opening up the zoning to be totally inclusionary and how that changes a corridor. So there's so many levers that are outside of the scope of our profession that are more political that can actually transform the future of places.
One thing I'd encourage everybody here to look at is the report we approved at Infrastructure and Environment Committee, I can't remember, this week, last week, on Under the Gardner. So a huge amount of work's been done, a multi-decadal vision that we are, of course, going to have to wrestle with the province over as part of the upload of the Gardner to make sure that we don't lose all these possibilities. But it's a beautiful visioning exercise. It's been done over a long period of time by many people. It's a very exciting vision, and we're going to need lots of people seizing opportunities to start realizing some of the bits before the province does something terrible.
Well, Councillor Sachs, I worked on that, and what's exciting is we never imagined that there's 65 acres under that roof, all across downtown. So the Bentway, the Bentway Phase 1 is as a huge test, but there's 65 acres, right? So there is terrain all over the city in the least likely places, and that's where the next generation of work has to take place.
Well, I mean, and looking at Vancouver, the Sanok development that the Squamish Nation is leading, which you are also working on, in fact, yet another public work project, that is a bit of a reserve that's gone back to the Squamish, which feels like leftover land, right? Kind of looked like nothing. And, it's a tremendous amount of new housing and community space that will change Vancouver. That's going into kind of a leftover corner that nobody had noticed, right? So there's potential there, right? John, you've been talking about this for years, though, as well, the possibility to sort of bring new life into, otherwise overlooked corners of our cities and to sort of create new sort of social and economic life in places where we might not expect to find it. Do you want to speak to that a little bit and talk about some examples of where we might find inspiration to do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Gardner is a really good example of a I guess that's more infrastructure, but you're saying leftover places. Yeah, I mean, I think we have the Portlands, which have been
Toronto Portlands
since 1912 when my family finished their Dutch work in Toronto, and it's still aching out there for something. I think that the Dawn, the park that's gone in on the Dawn is a kind of catalyst to that. And that's really interesting because there's an reinvented landscape. Perfect example, really interesting example.
Right, the project, the reinvention of the Don River, where a team led by landscape architects, Michael van Valkenburg's office, is doing this enormous hydrological, earthworks project that changes the way the river functions and changes the sort of the hydrology of a whole chunk of the city.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So and there are all kinds of other streams and valleys around the city.
So I guess we're going to move to questions soon, I think, right? Yeah, because it's just about time. So, interesting I guess I will leave you guys the option of wrapping up, having a few sort of final words when we finish the Q&A. But I think, one thing that I found interesting in this conversation is that the perceived opposition that was set up in the beginning of this conversation between, housing and a good public realm or a beautiful public realm or a healthy public realm turns out to be actually a little bit more complicated than that. What we've heard is that mixity, I think is the word that you used, Mark, of people as well as places benefits everything. That there is a virtuous circle between bringing people together and their resources to create places that are more beautiful and can also function better in ecological and social senses as well. So more density and, the beautiful public realm can actually reinforce each other. Yeah? We agree?
I think so, but it's also about not seeing them as put in housing and then apply landscape around it. I mean, this is about the synthesis of all these interconnected realms, right? I mean, that's where it means. That's why I really love your Department of Practical Studies. This just seems like, this is a really normal way. Yeah, right.
So we're going to go to questions. So there will be a couple of people roaming the room with mics, I believe. Yep. So if you want to raise your hand. And speaking of interdisciplinary work, I was just noticing on the way in here thinking of the redesign of St. George Street, which was done about 25 years ago now by architects, actually Brown and Story architects, and that was a street that and you worked on this too, you did.
Story herself.
And you together, and which at that time was what was your firm called at that time? Van Nostrand. That was Planning Alliance. Cassio and Nostrand, yeah, of course. So you had a hand in that. I mean, a fantastic project, interdisciplinary. Pat Hansen was. Well, there you go. Pat Hansen now of GH3. So architects, go on the mic, so we can hear you.
So we also thickened it. It's a perfect example of thickening, like all the little walls around the trees and the street texture itself were all really important parts of it. And mixing the trees, not putting a consistent line of trees that, if they were all elms, would have died, and that would have happened again. Right. But yeah, it's an interesting project. I think it stood up fairly well, and we started to say, well, that should be a prototype for north-south streets from Bloor to the water.
I mean,
it could be easily.
I think it does. It could be, and I think that stands up very well. And for those who aren't here or who haven't seen it, this was the redesign of St. George Street, the main artery through what is now the University of Toronto campus, which at one point was a very car-heavy street, and now has a very pleasant pedestrian character to it, thanks to that design intervention that brought together landscape architects and planners.
Yeah, it's all.
It's also interesting.
We're going to go to the questions now, Mark. Sorry. So at the back of the room, please.
My question is about prioritizing public spaces as it pertains to quality of life in the public realm. So in Toronto, we often work in inches, like a construction management plan will come down to that one parking space, or a zoning bylaw will come down to like a 0.5 buffer. But in a city where we're working at such small spaces, do you think it's important to spend our time and energy capitalizing on those parkettes on the ground floor of a residential space? Or as planners and landscape architects, we should be focused on the bigger things and making the overall quality of life in the bigger spaces more interesting? Any of the panel members?
Good. So should attention and resources go towards little incremental green space or public space, or should it be concentrated in larger ones? Anyone?
I think you've got to work where the opportunity is. If there's money to fix up a small space, fix it. Lots of people only, want to work on the big things. It's very hard to get money for the big things. I don't know. I think you have to seize whatever opportunity comes.
I agree with that, Councillor Sachs. But I would add, you also have to act on every opportunity, but also by seeing the big picture. So connecting a big picture with an individual act. That's what we're missing when a city feels like it's ad hoc and it's growing ad hoc. If there's a bigger idea, any disparate little piece, little confetti, wherever you point on a map can have a larger relationship. And I think that's where we need an obligation of all disciplines to have that holistic perspective of the city in which you work, so that every little dot, even if it's the smallest thing, has purpose, has meaning, can be an incremental thing towards a larger idea, which will have a huge impact.
Antonio?
So, clearly both small and big matter, right? But I'm interpreting the question to a certain extent around, in the context of limited resources, where do I prioritize? Right? So my invitation to any exercise that we're doing is to bring an equity lens into informing the prioritization. So if you're looking at where am I investing on parks, how am I investing in public transit, am I building a context that is going to, a project we're doing in the office is thermal comfort. Any aspect that you're doing is, if you bring an equity lens and really understand where the more vulnerable communities that you can start to serve, just by overlaying the map and the exercise that you're doing with an equity lens, it's very quickly going to inform where your priorities should be and where community is going to be most impacted. The communities that need it are going to be most impacted by your efforts.
Thank you. Anyone else want to take this, or should we move to the next question? All right, hands up. Go ahead, please.
Thanks so much. Reflecting on all the good conversation here, I think a lot of the people in the room, if not all of us, hear what you're saying and agree wholeheartedly with what's coming back. One thing we haven't talked about much is power structures, money. We've talked about equity, and that's such a huge part of this discussion. And I guess the way I want to put it is, in the context that we're working in, where we live in a capitalist society, people who have houses, I should say, not homes. People who own property probably don't want to split that up and share it. And, a lot of this is about generational wealth. And I think if we talk to people who are largely newcomers, or, people who are in the younger generation, people that have, lived, if not in poverty, in a situation where life has been unaffordable for a long time, I think there'd be a lot of nodding heads and agreement about this makes so much sense, a livable city. But because I think none of us are naive enough to believe that money doesn't have an influence in our politics and our policies, what are the mechanisms that you've found in your cumulative years of experience that have worked to have these conversations with people while we're still in an era where the power, we talk about 1%ers, there's the distribution of power and finance, resources is so inequitable. So, is it about having dinner conversations with people that are in those positions? Is it about writing opinion pieces, writing books, just the work that we're doing? What are the best ways?
To be clear, the question is how to make the case for the public realm, or a good public realm. Is that right?
Yeah, and just what are the best ways that you found to do that effectively?
Well, Mark, will you stand up and wave or something? Yes, you. All right. So Mark Richardson here is a really good example of how to make change. Yes, money plays a role, but a much, much bigger part of what makes a role is who shows up and speaks up. And Mark shows up and 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 speaks for building more housing for the people who don't live there yet. He takes people on tours to show planning stupidities, but the main thing is he keeps showing up. And if you pay attention to what happens at City Hall, you will see that young people very rarely show up. The people who show up, by and large, are homeowners my age or thereabouts, and they generally are speaking for what suits them. So, young people are notorious for not even voting. When I was campaigning, this campus was the worst place to get people to stop and talk or engage or show up, and the voting numbers are terrible. So if you want this point of view taken seriously, you have to vote, and you have to show up at the committees and speak up. So I hope I'll see somebody there, not just Mark, although he's great.
I also have an answer, a perspective. You mentioned, capitalism, and I am a big believer that the private sector has a bigger role to play. We are now in a dangerous trend of excluding the private sector. I don't know what city as a builder means, but it raises some questions.
We're talking here about housing in Toronto, or housing policy in Toronto.
Right. And take Tokyo, for example, which is known to be a city that actually doesn't suffer from affordability issues. Very rare in our generations, if you ask me. And it is a result of that 30 years ago, they just let the private sector build. Any transit projects in Tokyo or Japan are completely private, completely, including land use planning authority, and you, I don't know how many of you visited Tokyo, but you actually see a true mixed use hub on every station because the proximity to the station. So I do believe that, you mentioned capitalism and homeowners don't want to share so don't share your property. No one forces you to have a multiplex. But also don't show up in meetings objecting new developments turning up in your neighborhood. And it is a trend that I wonder where it's going. But I do believe the private sector has a bigger role to play. And maybe if the public sector will allow more of it, more variety, because affordability is a spectrum and we need more of everything. So if policy and regulation will take a step back in some way, I don't know exactly, but let the private sector take a bigger role.
All right, thank you. Anyone else want to talk about making the case for the public realm, or should we move to the next question? All right, next question, please. Who do we have? Who's got the mic? Sonia, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a few questions, but I'm going to try my best to combine them all into one and let you try to answer, so bear with me. So we've heard from the panel, I think across the board, that density is generally a good thing and that it's not mutually exclusive with a good public realm. And yeah, generally this is true, but like most things in the natural world, density is a spectrum. It's not black and white, it's not good or bad. It's how we balance density and how we shape density in different contexts in response to the kind of social and environmental relationships we want to set up. That's what really makes it successful. And so, we've cited examples of good public realm in dense cities, but in practice and in the public sphere, we also see these fights between issues, for example, like sun access, which is an essential quality of life and of good public realm. And I would argue a human right, a basic human right. Sun access, or shadows, are often pitted against housing as if they are mutually exclusive. And so I wanted to ask the panel, what are your thoughts on this? Are we at the point in Toronto where we have to give up sunlight access in the public realm to maximize housing?
I think you have to do some new design guidelines. David Garby commissioned that when he was the mayor. They're way out of date, but they were all about sunshine, wind, the environmental effects on building. And it's serious. You create really strong arguments that way because you're showing everybody the ways of incorporating green and buildings, air and light and sun are critical. So it's that was an interesting exercise. It's not out of date even, but it needs to be done again.
Yeah, I was going to say that to me, what you described is underlines the need for more creative collaboration around new typological inventions around housing that are woven with environment and quality, and this idea of quality life plus density. We don't have a lot of experiments in Toronto that we can look at, right? We see small single-family, like we see those staple neighborhoods, and then we see towers, and we see a lot of tower and podiums, right? We see a lot of Vancouver here. I don't see that in all cities. I see cities where they're finding density, and takes different forms. So that's possible, and that's a creative exercise. That's something that can be done now that there are real constraints, and also real awareness about what does a person expect or demand from living in a city. So I think we haven't seen enough dexterity, you could say, and we've just like held a lot of strict typologies. I mean, it doesn't solve the affordability element, but I think it points to the fact that there are a lot more formats for housing woven with landscape than we're seeing.
Let's talk about shadows. I think it's a very important question. I think shadow is a magic word the planning system taught NIMBYs to use, and say use that word. It's the magic word for us to get what you want. Let's talk about shadows for a moment. You mentioned the public realm. You want to protect parks. You want to really protect sidewalks. That's fine. But what we are protecting is private backyards on an expense of someone else to call a place to call home. It's as simple as that. That is the formula this city has been using. If you ask me, wind is much more, you feel the effect of wind much more than it is about sun and shadow. And one last comment is that in the winter months, because the sun is already so low, even the precious single-family house neighborhoods cast a very long shadow. So if we really look into, I have models, I'll show you, I have images. Trust me, I've studied the topic, especially because I'm presenting this to communities. So the case for shadow is something that the public uses, abuses even, much more than it is in practical reality.
One other piece of that I want to point out is the way our climate is changing. So you think about the old rule that in cold climates you want wide streets and in hot climates you want narrow streets. Well, we have a cold climate and now we are also getting a hot climate. So we know that the number of days over 80 or 90 degrees in Toronto is going to explode through the climate change, urban heat island effect, and so on. And so the number of days when being out in the sun is unbearable is going to be skyrocketing. So the impact of shadows is changing, and we're not ready for it.
No one is complaining about trees, right?
Shadows
from trees. I mean.
No one is complaining about shadows from trees. That's absolutely right. They complain about shadows from buildings. They don't complain usually about shadows from trees. Usually, sometimes they do. Keeping the trees alive is increasingly difficult with the drought and the wind and so on. But yes, planting more trees is great. But again, that conflicts directly with our intensification. So I mean, I did a motion at council to see if we to ask for a policy so that as much as possible we are flexible on our building rules so we can protect trees when we're allowing laneway houses and garden suites and fourplexes and so on. We're losing soft surfaces. That's going to back us into $5 billion of sewers. Or our sewers are already surcharging as the rainfall becomes more intense and runoff gets faster. So there's no free lunch.
Well, I mean, if I could just interject before Antonio does. Toronto, I mean, these are Toronto issues, but they're not at all unique to Toronto. Toronto has and the solution, likewise, there can be common solutions when it comes to the public realm. Toronto has a lot of roads, has a lot of asphalt. That is all, publicly owned space, which could be much, much narrower than it is. I mean,
working on it. I'm working on it.
I hear you, but there's a lot of square kilometers of asphalt that could be planted if that's an issue. I think, Antonio.
First of all, Alex, you can always interject before I do. I'll paraphrase a phrase that I think has been coined to many different people, but I heard it first from Ken Greenberg, so I'll blame him for it, which is, it's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense, right? So in many regards, it actually is a design question. It requires a bunch of people, a lot of trace paper, a lot of markers, and a lot of time to figure this out. So imagine only if you could have an entire profession dedicated of people to designing the public realm. What would you call that? Right? Exactly, right? We need designers. We need people who there isn't a policy. There isn't, a one solution that is going to serve every context. It's complicated. It's complex. It requires a process. It requires a group of people working it through.
Well, and there's a governance problem here too, in that cities in North America don't have a sort of an overarching design authority. There's no city architect or anything parallel to that. So qualitative questions that cut across transportation, city planning, parks aren't really handled by anyone, right? Which I think is a really big problem, which could be easily fixed. In the city of Boston, the current mayor of Boston, who's very interested in landscape, Michelle Wu, has introduced a a director of the public realm, I think is the title, to address exactly that, right? John.
That's because there was an Olmsted landscape there.
That's right. Everybody loves Olmsted.
I was talking to Carolyn earlier tonight. I think one of the other things is just working together with TCRA, they have all this responsibility. TRC, sorry.
The Toronto Region Conservation Authority.
Yeah, right. Anyway, that's an important aspect because they're looking after all the watersheds and the valley spreads, and they're in a really critical role that doesn't seem to be acknowledged by the city. It's like somebody else's responsibility rather than you work together to make to improve the stream, whatever it is.
Well, also, I think what's exciting about Toronto's growth is that the culture of design, the literacy of all citizens in the city on topics like the public realm and housing is so high now. So this is huge. So we have conversations about the public realm now, right? It's taken generations of practitioners to build up to that, and now it's a topic. So we can talk about architecture, we can talk about landscape, we can talk about housing, we can understand how it benefits us, and there are now expectations in the public. I think that's a huge step.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi everyone, thank you very much. My name is Alvin Tejo. I'm a city councillor in Mississauga, which is obviously next door to Toronto. I know we're in the middle of Toronto right now having this conversation. I do want to thank the Ontario Association for Landscape Architects for putting this together, because this is a phenomenal conversation that I feel like is representative of housing Twitter, but in real life, so this is fantastic. I do want to talk a bit about the suburban transition, right? In the context of places like Mississauga, we're only celebrating our 50th anniversary. You don't want to talk about a new community that's been built out. We don't have the placemaking that you're talking about. We don't have a lot of the interconnectivity that you're looking for. There are neighborhoods that are completely locked, that are so unwalkable that it would take you 15 minutes or 20 minutes at a brisk pace to get out of the neighborhood to get to a gas station as a corner store, right? And when we're talking about a city that is 85% trips are done by cars, with a very, very minimum viable network in terms of transit and cycling that most people aren't willing to try. How do we renovate? Where do we prioritize? I'm running for mayor right now. I'm talking about building more housing, but 71% of Mississauga is single-family houses, right? And when I did the fourplex motion initially in the city of Mississauga, we lost the vote on a tie, right? And I was able to bring it back because Bonnie came back to break the tie for me. But this is the resistance that we're getting from people who cannot see themselves past their current neighborhoods, and they can't reimagine their current neighborhoods. I know there's NIMBYs everywhere, but we're talking about neighborhoods that actually have no solution for walkability, for commercial, for bikeability, who have the largest right-of-ways that you can imagine, right? I mean, you go anywhere else and you think, I don't know, I understand how this isn't a 4-lane highway, but it's actually just one, right? So, very interested in some of your comments on this, and I know I've met with some of you before, but just sort of in that suburban context, where would you prioritize how we change? How quickly can we change in order to get that buy-in that we need from the rest of the city?
Sounds like you need some new transportation engineers in Mississauga. But folks, who would like to try and tackle that very important and big question?
That's impossible to answer. That is just that is like the card that so much of Canada was dealt, that we've spent since the Second World War building places like you just described. It's such a huge fundamental topic. My first reaction is that you have so much green, you have so much soil in your city. You also have a lot of asphalt, but you have so much soil in your city. To imagine it more from the center Wellington perspective, like that to me is the only radical thing. You like to imagine an agricultural model in Mississauga and then an intense urban model in your city center and on your waterfront, because Port Credit is Mississauga. You have two worlds and they're completely different, and then you have a chance to, I don't know, like how does Detroit think about it? It has to think radically. How does Mississauga think? It has to think radically. But you have quite a systemic problem physically manifest on your hands.
Fantastic. Nama?
I think you're bringing up a part of a question that I wanted to actually tell Alex that you didn't ask us, and that is the dependency on cars and Mississauga. So for me, to answer your question, for me is the first thing is to invest in transit. I saw you coming in today. You were biking here. I was biking here. I know your daughter. I don't know you, but I know your daughter doesn't own a car as well, because we talk about it. By the way, horrible day to cycle today. Horrible. I was like texting my husband that he needs to get me some spare clothes because I was soaking wet. But how do you, and every time that I speak to students, and you talk about the climate change, and I feel like it's something that we say, yeah, the government will solve, well, should be very careful, but the government will solve it. We'll leave it to the G7 countries to solve it. But there is something that we could do, us, and especially the next generation. And every time when I speak to students, I'm telling you, my hope is that you will never buy your first car. So I don't know about, my parents, can I really ask them to ditch their car and lifelong habits? But for me, the question is how you get more transit, because transit is the foundation. If you actually compare what Toronto has that Mississauga doesn't have, is transit. That's the biggest difference. And I know that you have, for example, a major transit corridor, and now you are debating about parking minimums. That's fun, right, to debate with the public. Same thing with you. Can you do university and tell people we're going to reduce university? As you were describing it, it sounds like an amazing dream. I just imagine at the same time what people were telling you about it. So it's how we break the love affair we have with the cars in Mississauga, in Toronto.
I think you could, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I had a couple of suggestions. None of it's easy. But at 50 years, you're starting to have people in those buildings who bought them when they were young and who aren't young anymore. And they are going to reach the point where they can't drive. So, and those folks vote. So I think that you could have a chance of finding a community that wants to be your pilot, to try it out, so they can think about, how do we keep our independence when we can't drive? How do we improve our community when we can't drive? And people always want to see somebody else do it first. In Toronto, we have a couple of areas where there are residents associations, the Pocket, the Harvard Village Residents Association, very close to here, who've been real leaders as a group in finding a way forward. Maybe you can find a group like that who will be focused on what it's going to mean for them and help you demonstrate that there's a possibility.
Councillor, or should I refer to you as future mayor? I had the opportunity to ask that question in Mississauga to It was thousands of people. We ran workshops with 500 people at a time. This was still Mayor Hazel McCallion's days. And in one of our workshops, Rick Mercer shows up, right? And he was still doing his report on CBC at the time. And he asked Hazel, mayor at the time, that same question. And her answer was transit. What would I do different? What would I do now? It would be transit. But what I wanted to share at this point is what I was hearing overwhelmingly in Mississauga was not more of the same. It wasn't the, I want to live the lifestyle of my parent, right? It was a different vision. And it had to do with all of those places where, frankly, a lot of the youth are flocking away from Mississauga towards. It's places that are walkable. It's places where they can bump into friends. It's places where there's an element of shared economy, where there's a very different lifestyle. So the redefinition of quality of life was several decades away from where the urban fabric was being reflected. So that actually gives me a tremendous amount of optimism for this world, right? Because it means that the values of the emerging generations have the potential to reshape the spaces that had been created by the past generation.
Yeah, and on that note, stop into your local design school, U of T, TMU. There are people in that generation reinventing Mississauga in their projects every year, and they're breaking down, they're completely chopping up those typologies, rethinking the street frontages, rethinking the backyards as more collective spaces, as natural corridors, bring habitat, wildlife, like radically rethinking that physical format for a completely new way of living. And it's done by that generation. So it's with that in mind, and it's about cohabiting these like 3,000 square foot houses, right? Like it's a totally different way of thinking. So you'll enjoy that if you take a walk into the studio.
Fantastic. So maybe on that hopeful, forward-looking note, we should wrap up here. I know we're over time, so everyone, please join me in thanking our panel. And thank you for coming. Hold on, guys. Hold on. There's housekeeping.
Okay, so don't go away. You stay there. We're going to get a group picture of you. So we've come to the end of our, I really wouldn't call it a debate, but more of a discussion. And it was very civil, and I thank you for your civility. And I'd like to extend our thanks to the audience for taking the time to come out and listen to this important discussion, which affects everyone around us and in our community. It affects us in my community as well. We invite you to stay a little bit longer, engage with the panelists, and enjoy some refreshment. We'd like to thank our respected panelists whose insight, expertise, and willingness to engage in this dialogue reflect a commitment to drive positive change to the future growth of Canadian cities, both large and small. The diverse range of viewpoints you have provided not only stimulate critical thinking, but also inspire future exploration and collaboration within our community. Also, I'd like to extend a very large thank you to Sonia for all your help. Sonia, and her tireless effort in bringing our panel together shaped the breadth and scope of this discussion tonight. As a token of our appreciation, we'd like to offer you, our panelists, a copy of a landscape approach from local communities to territorial systems. The book promotes a landscape approach as a method of understanding and addressing the complex interdependent issues of the environmental and climate change, ecological degradation, and social cultural inequalities. And we'll also have that for sale out at the back. So thanks again. Appreciate it.